she created an idea of what it was to be a good Pole, as it were, which survived throughout the 19th century and was emulated by others, because she created a sort of finishing school, in effect, informally.
Hello. Izabela Czartoryska was an extraordinary woman. Born into Polish aristocracy, she witnessed a host of major historical events in the 18th and early 19th centuries, from the collapse of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon, and the Industrial Revolution. Her biographer and descendant, Adam Zamoyski, joins me to discuss 18th century Europe through her eyes. Adam returns having discussed the movie Napoleon and the 1812 March on Moscow in previous episodes. Links are in the show notes. Coming up, I have Socrates, 1930s traitors, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the SAS in the invasion of Europe, and for the 80th anniversary in September, a 3-part special on Operation Market Garden. Saul David joins to discuss Arnhem. Gordon and Philip return to chat the wider operation itself. And the September Film Club is a bridge too far. But until then, I'll hand you over to me chatting with Adam Zamoyski on 18th century Europe and Izabela Czartoryska. Adam, welcome back to the podcast. It's a great pleasure to have you back, particularly with a new book. I think this is the first book you've brought out since Aspects of History even existed. So a huge pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here.
So Adam, this book is Izabela the Valiant, Izabela Czartoryski.
Czartoryska, yes.
Oh, I'm okay. Forgive me. And she is an ancestor of yours. I'm not going to count the number of greats.
I think it's 4 great-grandmothers. And the subtitle is The Story of an Indomitable Polish Princess. But actually, her father was German, but assimilated in Poland. And her mother was a Czartoryska, and she married a Czartoryskian, but her mother was a Czartoryska. But she had quite a lot of Scots ancestry, which is unusual, and so she had sort of Earls of Argyll and so on in her ancestry. So
are these Catholics who have fled Scotland?
One of them was, yes. There was a man called, he was a Gordon actually. He was the second Marquis of Huntly, and he took service in Poland, as did many Scots, and he also brought his 2 sisters, and they married into the Polish aristocracy, and there's quite a descent. Actually, there's so many Scots in Poland that in the when I forget whether it was the Old Pretender. I think it was the Old Pretender who, finding himself penniless, actually got permission from the King of Poland, who was then John III Sobieski, to have a voluntary tax laid on all the Scots in Poland, because it was the largest agglomeration of Scots outside Scotland were in Poland at the end of the 17th century. And so there are quite a few Polish names which are in fact off. There are plenty of people with Scots names or half. Actually, Charles Guthrie, the former Lord Guthrie now, traced some cousins in Poland who are called Guthrie, spelled G-U-T-T-R-Y. And he was very pleased because he found that there was a Guthrie in the Polish army at the relief of Vienna in 1683.
Well, in fact, doesn't Isabella's husband, wasn't he in love with a half Scottish?
Yes, he was in love with he had an affair in St. Petersburg with, she was called Countess Bruce, and she was one of the ladies in waiting to the Empress Elizabeth, I think, and was extremely influential. She comes up a lot in memoirs of the time. She was quite an influential person, I believe. So,
And was her father then the general at Poltava?
I don't know. I haven't researched that, but I wouldn't swear to it. But very possibly.
Anyway, we've digressed off onto Scots.
But the best things about history are digression.
yes, I suppose so. And what I thought would be useful, particularly for listeners who maybe aren't familiar with because obviously Poland of the mid 18th to late 18th century is not the Poland of today. It's a very interesting. It's a commonwealth with Lithuania.
Yes,
is that right? And it's quite an interesting state, but it's obviously got a very large Russia to the east, as is common throughout Polish history, that I suppose views it within its sphere of influence, and therefore...
Yes, but Russia was still a growing power, and it was very much increasing its influence and its scope. But between 1772, it's worth remembering, the first partition of Poland, and 1812, as I pointed out, because Napoleon had said it was intolerable the way Russia had expanded. And I actually calculated that in those 50 years, between 1772 and 1812, Russia had pushed her frontiers 600 miles westwards into Europe, which was a hell of an interference in Europe, rather than it had also expanded in the east, founding colonies not just in Alaska but right down the Californian coast, as well as south into the Caucasus and so on, and Crimea, obviously, which it acquired during Catherine's reign. So it was a growing power, and what was interesting about that period was that both Prussia and Russia were energetically growing. Prussia, even at the death of Frederick the Great, was still a very small country with a very large army. Well, no, actually, at the accession, probably, Frederick the Great, and he increased it significantly. The first increase was absolutely brilliant trick. He essentially put the cat in amongst the pigeons in 1768 in Poland, because he could see that the new king of Poland, Stanislaus Augustus, was beginning to reform the country, and if his reforms were going to actually bear fruit, Russia's expansion would be blocked, and it would never be able to connect with its East Prussia, because it was cut off. Because essentially it was the electorate of Brandenburg, and he'd managed to take Silesia off the Austrians, off Saxony, and then other provinces off the Austrians. But he badly needed to connect up with East Prussia, and so a resurgent Poland would have been curtains for his plans. And he started this nonsense about demanding. He persuaded Catherine that she must demand that her Orthodox subjects in Poland and his Protestant subjects in Poland, who, by the way, were the least discriminated against religious minorities anywhere in the world, should have not just equal rights, which they had, but that they should be represented in the Senate and given automatic representation and so on, which was clearly unacceptable, and he knew it was going to be unacceptable. And Russia's
That's even to quite a progressive state, as it.
Yes, and even the Russia's strongman in Poland, Prince Repnin, said to Catherine, "Look, this is just, this is red rag to a bull. It's unnecessary." But she went along, and of course that started a war, a sort of a civil war, really, because the Polish crown, had to call in, had to suppress the rebellion. It was a very complicated situation, the outcome of which was, of course, the first partition, because then Frederick said, "Oh, well, the only way of pacifying the country is to carve it up." And Catherine was very hesitant, but he played a wonderful trick on her by, there was a Turkish ambassador envoy turned up in Berlin, whom he had not wanted to see at all, but suddenly he saw the opportunity, and he laid on lavish feasts for this man and started courting him like mad, which of course panicked Catherine, thinking that there was going to be an alliance between Prussia and the Porte, which would upset her plans down in the south. And so she quickly agreed. And Russia got a lot of territory, but fairly useless territory, out of the first partition, whereas Frederick got some very, very valuable territory. And then that set the precedent for the next ones. And essentially, Prussia outmaneuvered Russia over that whole episode.
And what of Lithuania in that carve-up?
Well, most of that went to Russia in the end, and in fact, all of it in the end. So it was a great mess. And then, of course, Napoleon comes in, and comes in this book about Izabela. All these things are very pertinent, because she visits Berlin, she talks to Frederick the Great and Frederick William.
Well, even from a very young age, she's married at 16, I think. And even at such a young age, she's involved, or at least a witness to, quite a lot of sort of faction playoffs within the...
Yes, in no time at all, because the man she marries is the prime representative of the Czartoryski clan, who...
This is the Familia.
Yes, and they were known as the Familia because they worked as a clan, and their plan was to regenerate Poland, and the only way they could see doing this was to place one of their number on the throne and turn the elective monarchy into a dynastic constitutional monarchy. And they saw themselves as naturally entitled to this because they were of Jagiellon descent, so they were, as it were, a branch of the family that had ruled, the dynasty that had ruled Poland for 300 years. So her husband they wanted her to put her husband forth as their candidate. He didn't want it because he just hated the idea of having to be a political animal, and so he stepped aside in favor of his cousin Stanisław Poniatowski, whose mother was a Czartoryska and who was very much part of the clan, and so they backed him, and so she was involved even at the age of 17. She accompanied her husband to Paris because he went off to talk to the French about support for their plans, and he travelled many times. He also came to England to talk to, well, certainly Newcastle's ministry had been very interested in taking a hand in Poland and had identified the Familia as the main political force that would suit them, but they were not going to get involved, but they definitely were on the sidelines. And in fact, later, I think it was Burke, very much lamented the fact that Britain hadn't been involved. And I think there were attempts in England in 72 and 73 to combine with France to actually try and reverse the first partition.
Militarily?
Yes, very interesting. It's not been written up properly. There have been articles on this subject, but there definitely was a movement to involve Austria, France and Britain. And because of the French connection with Austria, Marie Antoinette and so on, the idea was that Austria would be prepared to give up. Maria Theresa was actually, well, they always say she cried as she signed the partition because the Austrians weren't happy with it, but felt if everybody was taking bits of Poland, they wanted their share.
Alliance with England and France
at that point period was almost
it's extraordinary,
unthinkable. But there were feelers, and the idea was that because France hated the idea of an increase of Prussia's power, so it could swallow possibly acting in union with Britain if it meant that Prussia could be made to cough up its part of the partition of Poland and thereby weakened. Austria would have, if the others had given up, then Austria would have done so. And Russia was keen on at least a tacit alliance with France. So, there were. It was a possibility that was floated, and she was caught up in the middle of this because one of the main proponents from the French side was the Duc de Lauzun, who was her lover, and almost thought up the whole plan in order to be made a nominated ambassador in Warsaw so as to be able to continue his affair.
We should mention Izabela is married to Adam, but it's not a particularly passionate marriage. She has no surviving children from Adam, does she, Bridget?
No, she had immediately had a son by him who died at the age of 1. She had a daughter who died in infancy, and then they had another daughter who, unfortunately, her dress caught fire when she was 14, and she suffered terrible burns and died after 3 days. Thereafter, there were several deaths in infancy, but they're all recorded. But the surviving progeny was fathered by the King of Poland, Stanislas Augustus, her first cousin once removed. The second one, that was a girl. The second one was by the Russian ambassador, Prince Repnin, into whose arms she was rather pushed by the king and possibly her uncles in order to stop him implementing Catherine's policy of destroying their influence.
He was rather devoted to her, though, throughout his life, wasn't he?
Repnin, yes, absolutely. He was, in Polish historiography, it's always made out that she was basically just a bit of a bit light under the tail, but there's absolutely no evidence of her having had more than 4 lovers, and they were all, or certainly 3 of them, were real profound love affairs. And for God's sake, a girl can. She had a very complacent husband. They had a wonderful relationship. They adored each other, but they seem to have stopped having sexual relations quite early on, and but he accepted all her children as his own. There's a wonderful quote from a British man, George Burnett, who spent a lot of time in Poland, and very amusingly writes about how I quote from memory, he writes something like, in Britain, most gentlemen are very keen to be sure that all the inhabitants of the nursery are due to their own efforts, but in Poland this doesn't seem to be the case, and he thinks it's rather admirable the way that official fathers accept their children, as indeed did Izabela's husband. And of course there was an awful irony in all this, that her eldest son, Adam Jerzy, who's the son of the Russian ambassador, Prince Repnin, was then in 1795 sent to St. Petersburg as a kind of hostage to the Czartoryskis' good behavior after the Third Partition. And there he became an absolute bosom soulmate of the young Grand Duke Alexander I, future Alexander I. They were brought together by great affinities of every kind, and particularly the young Alexander dreaming of reforming Russia into a progressive state, who'd been brought up by César de la Harpe, the Swiss philosophe, and he'd been brought up in the tradition of the French Enlightenment. And so the moment he became emperor, he called Adam Zamoyski to his side and kept him there, first of all, as his unofficial foreign minister, because the young Adam did not wish to have the title, because he knew that at court he was hated for being a kind of Polish fifth columnist. And Russian nationalists all believed that he was going to try and somehow seduce the Tsar into coughing up the partitions and reducing Russia's sphere, which was ironic because, of course, the young Adam Zamoyski became the lover of Alexander's wife and produced a child, a daughter, by her. And at the same time, Alexander had a Polish mistress, because the Naryshkin woman was in fact Polish by birth. I think she was a Skowrońska or something. And so there was a fear in Russia, as there always is in Russia, a terrible fear that somehow
Foreigners are going to take everything.
Yes, foreigners, yes, terrible foreigners, foreign agents are going to take about. And at the same time in Poland, he was looked on askance as a possible Russian agent. So the poor man had a terrible time. But above all, poor old Izabela, who adored him, unlike most 18th century women, she brought up her own children. And
so no nannies and
no nannies, well, hardly any nannies. The girls had a nanny, but who'd been her old nanny, so she wasn't. And Izabela looked to their education and their upbringing, and
we should mention she was tremendously well read, wasn't she?
Well, that's it, because I mean the poor girl had been totally uneducated, brought up in the Lithuanian, what's now a Lithuanian countryside, actually Belarusian countryside. It was then the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and completely uneducated. She was brought up speaking French because that was normal, but she had absolutely no education. And when at the age of 17 she was in Paris, she went to see Rousseau at Montmorency, having never heard of him before or of any of his books, but everybody was talking about him. She was highly unimpressed by a rather grubby man who talked too loud, and she couldn't understand a word of the metaphysics he was spouting on about. But she then went on and started to read his books, and not only his books, and very much fell under his spell, and particularly of his ideas on the upbringing of children. And so she brought up her children very much as her companions. Her letters to them are extraordinary because they're like letters to a friend, a grown-up friend. She never talks down to them. And as well as educating herself and them, formerly, she also created in her idyllic, bucolic village outside Warsaw. Each of them was given a cottage and had to tend their kitchen garden. They had to tend their chickens. They had to learn about how to be a proper shepherd, not like Marie Antoinette dressing up. there were no ribbons on the lambs there. They were actually reared for slaughter and food. They had to learn how to milk cows and how to deal with all those things and dig up potatoes. She was very, very close to them. And of course, she was separated from her favourite, Adam Zamoyski, for years because he was tied to the Russian court. First of all, because he was a hostage. Then the furious Paul I, on discovering that his daughter-in-law had produced a son by him, at first he wanted to send him to Siberia, then relented and sent him, nominated him the Russian minister at the court of Sardinia, which was a non-post because the king of Sardinia had been chucked out of Turin and was, because he was also the king of Savoy, the Victor Emmanuel. So he was knocking about, first of all in Florence, then in Rome, and then when the French troops obliged him, the king of Sardinia, to take refuge in Sicily, Adam Zamoyski was left without a job, and so he spent his time visiting the sites and sending home to his mother, who kept bombarded him with letters saying that she wanted a nice Roman sarcophagus and a nice Roman wellhead and some nice stuff and any interesting things. Amongst other things, he sent her the famous Leonardo da Vinci portrait of a lady with an ermine, which is now in the Krakow Museum.
Which she founded, didn't she?
Which she founded, yes. And then he was recalled from Rome by Alexander to become his foreign minister and so on. And so for years she couldn't see him at all, which was very, very sad for her.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, she's the witness to two seismic events in world history, really. The French Revolution and then later the Industrial Revolution, when she travels to England and sees the Industrial Revolution actually taking place. So I wondered what her view of the French Revolution was.
She didn't really express many opinions on it. She spent a few weeks in Paris in 1791.
That's quite a dicey time to be in Paris.
Yes, she didn't really, nowhere did I find any extensive remarks about that. Much more interesting was her time in Britain, because she then was accompanied by her son, and he was on an educational tour. He was studying the British Constitution under Lord Lansdowne, who was a friend of his father's. He had a brief. He was supposed to go to the theatre. He was supposed to attend sermons in Anglican churches. He was supposed to attend sessions of Parliament. He attended the sessions of the trial of Warren Hastings. So did Izabela, out of interest. She was fascinated by these things. He went to court. He was supposed to stay in country houses. And then they travelled around Britain and they visited Windsor Castle, they visited gardens, country houses, Stonehenge, obviously. At Portsmouth, they inspected a man of war from stem to stern. They attended a meeting with Dr. Priestley, who didn't impress Izabela, Stratford-on-Avon, but also places of memory, which she was very keen on. So any historic castles where either great or terrible things had happened. And she loved to keep a something that reminded her of places. So at Fotheringay, for instance, where Mary Queen of Scots was executed, there wasn't much but she could find, but she took a couple of stones, fragments of stones. At Stonehenge, she obviously couldn't take a stone, but she scraped some moss off, which she took back to Poland, and then she put in her museum as a kind of an awakener of memory and imagination. But also they visited Ironbridge, Coalbrookdale, factories, workhouses, prisons, hospitals, public baths. She even crawled down into a coal mine on all fours. This is where she records she saw a vision of hell. And they then travelled all the way up to Scotland, where she wanted to visit the places associated with Fingal and Ossian and all that, and so on, and to visit her kinsmen at Inverary, the Gordons and so on. And she stayed at all the grand country houses and forged a huge friendship with the Howards at Castle Howard, where they actually asked her to carve her initials on a beech tree, and they were joined by 3 generations because of her children and grandchildren who visited in the 19th century. Unfortunately, attempts to find the beech tree, I think it must have gone by now, but she kept a diary of all this and her comments on it, and they are very interesting. And she was terribly impressed by England and writes that she thought it was extraordinary that nowhere on earth was there such concern for the less fortunate in society, that after all, things were not brilliant, but the poorhouses and things did actually care for people, which wasn't the case in many other countries. And she loved Britain, but she famously wrote to her sister that she said, but there are 2 things would not be able to accommodate myself to in this country. One is the climate, and the other is the society. The first is too damp, the second too cold. The first is bad for my health, the second bad for my soul. Her writings, her jottings and her letters provide some extraordinary sort of aperçus, looks into various aspects of European history. Her encounters with Joseph II, who seems to have taken more than a liking to her, she finds him pretty odd, and he confides in her and says, he actually tells her that he thinks he's on his way, when she meets him, he's on his way to Kherson to meet.
He's the son of Maria Theresa, isn't he?
That's right, and the future, already the Emperor Joseph II, yeah, and the great reforming liberal. And on his way to meet Catherine of Russia, who's just floated down the Dnieper in that great flotilla with the Potemkin villages on the banks to inspect her new conquests. And he travels to meet her. But on his way, he tells Izabela he finds her utterly ridiculous, and then tells her stories which she says modesty prevents her from recording, unfortunately.
Oh, that's a shame.
And she finds his sense of humour bizarre.
But she's also the witness to the rise of Napoleon as well. So
yes, exactly. And then, but even before that, then she meets Joseph's successor, the future Francis II, and whom she finds pretty odd as well, but who also is quite indiscreet in some ways. And she had obviously something about her, a charm that really drew people in. And
was it a warmth, do you think?
I think there was a warmth and an enthusiasm and an impish intelligence but sense of fun that was contagious. And people really did fall for her on the whole. And then, of course, along comes Napoleon, and the whole everything is messed up because her son, her elder son, Adam, is, although he's after Austerlitz and the debacle, he resigned as foreign minister. Alexander wouldn't let him go, and he remained a councillor of state, and he kept begging Alexander to let him go, which Alexander refused to do. So Napoleon comes in and creates the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and the younger brother, Constanti, who's the son of the Duc de Lauzun, by the way, raises a regiment for the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and first of all fights against the Austrians in 1809, although at the beginning of that war, his estate being in Galicia, he was technically a subject of the Austrian emperor. So, he's rebelling against the Austrians, which is quite tricky for Izabela and her husband, because their estate is also was then in Austria, and Adam, her husband, was an Austrian field marshal. So it was an absurd situation. One son is in the service of Russia, and then the other one, with his regiment, marches off in 1812 and invades Russia under Napoleon. And what's more, they're related to Alexander, because Alexander's mother was a Württemberg princess, and her younger brother married Izabela's daughter by the former king of Poland, Marianna. And so they're actually relations by marriage. And when Alexander arrives to stay with Izabela in their country house at Puławy on his way to Austerlitz, he calls Izabela's daughter ma tante, auntie, and he calls Izabela, he refers to her as maman, mummy, and thanks her effusively for giving her son to him whom he regards as his brother. So it's quite an odd situation.
So her second son, as part of the invasion of Russia?
Yes, and he is wounded at capture of Smolensk and gets decorated with the Legion of Honor by Napoleon for that.
Is he sent back to safety and warmth?
No. He carries on, and he does the whole retreat and turns up wrapped in rags on Izabela's doorstep in 1813. But the marvelous thing is Alexander then embraces him and says, Alexander was also this curious, he had this spaniel-like need for being loved, and he loved making generous gestures and wanted to think of himself as a kind of, in terms of a sort of chivalrous knight. He always wore uniforms, just, to underline the fact that he was a man of the sword rather than of the pen. And he embraced Constantine, saying, I love you more for having fought for your country, even though you are fighting against me. So it was an immensely complicated whirlpool of events that Izabela was caught up in. And of course, because earlier in 1795, when Catherine was still empress, she was convinced that the Czartoryskis had conspired with the patriots under Kosciuszko to start the insurrection of 1794 against Russia. And so she instructed General der Felden to destroy her country house and park and everything at Puławy. And there's an account by one of the Russian officers who just can't believe what they have to do, that literally trash the entire palace and the park. And he says the park is comparable to that of Tsarskoye Selo, the famous park outside, the retreat outside St. Petersburg. And it's utterly trashed, uprooting trees, every single window is smashed, every single door is ripped off. Every piece of furniture is smashed up and piled into a great mountain in the courtyard, along with sculptures, broken porcelain, shredded pictures, paintings, prints. The entire library is either carted off to St. Petersburg or shredded. So when she arrives back, there are sort of prints torn from books, caught in the leaves of trees fluttering around the place. And of course, the usual trademark of Russian soldiers, excrement smeared on the walls of all the ballrooms and so on. And then in 1831, when after the Polish uprising, the same happens again to the house she's rebuilt. Except that time, when the war starts, they start hiding and smuggling out her collections, particularly the historical collections, which she was so important.
Well, she's 85 or 86 by then. I mean, she lived a long old life.
And the awful thing is that she's in her house with a couple of her daughters and a whole lot of local, both gentry and peasant women, who all take refuge in the house thinking it's going to be a safe haven. But the Russian army turns up, and no less a person than her grandson, the son of her daughter by the Württemberg, who's by then a Russian in Russian service, actually bombards the palace she's in. It's just a mad story.
Knowing full well what he was doing?
Yes, absolutely.
Extraordinary.
I think he was pretty weird.
Well, look, Adam, we could go on, but I think we're going to have to wind up soon. So I was thinking about, because she has an incredible cultural legacy, Izabela, but also I was reading at the end of the book all her descendants as well. So she's this sort of great figure, really, in Polish society.
Yes, and she had a huge descent, but she also, she created an idea of what it was to be a good Pole, as it were, which survived throughout the 19th century and was emulated by others, because she created a sort of finishing school, in effect, informally. And that was continued by her son Adam when he was in exile in Paris. But also she created these two extraordinary collections. One, a historical collection, which was supposed to be a kind of lesson, a performance lesson in Polish history, and the other was a kind of sentimental collection, supposed to take you through European civilization, actually world civilization. And I mean, her collecting is a whole, and of course she wrote the first history book she opened the first village school for peasants and wrote the first history book for children, and then other texts for children. So she was a hugely influential figure, and her daughters created the most important salons in Poland, where Chopin had his first performance outside his home sphere, and where many talents were nurtured. So her legacy is huge, and then her children were allied to all the Catholic royal houses of Europe, and which made them cousins of everybody from the emperors of France and even to Queen Victoria. And there's even now the pretenders to the to the imperial throne of France is a descendant, as is the pretender to the throne of Naples and Sicily, and as is the present Queen of the Belgians.
So Victoria's the grandmother of Europe. You could describe Izabela as, I guess, the grandmother of Central Europe.
Well, of quite a lot of people, yes. She had, I think, 3 Habsburg prime ministers and various field marshals and councillors, generals and so on.
And a kickboxer, yes. I was reading.
Yes, and a couple of people beatified, certainly one cardinal, and the list goes on.
And a historian.
And a historian, yes.
Well, Adam, look, this has been so entertaining. Thank you very much for your time, and best of luck with the book.
Thank you. One could have gone on forever. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes if you want to find out more. And do join me for future episodes. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.